We start our special plenary session devoted to Professor Władysław Żarnicz. The title of session is Logic, Learning and Communication, and it is dedicated to Professor Żarnicz. I am very honored to welcome all participants of this session. And as the first will be speaker, Professor Yamada. The title of the lecture is Acts of Commanding, Promising, Requesting, and Asserting in Dynamified Multi-Agent Deontic Epistemic Logic. Please, you can start. We don't see the screen. Oh. Okay.
Okay.
Right. Yes, we can see everything.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, let me start. So this is the talk, title of my talk, and this is the structure of my talk. And let me go into introduction. Władysław Żarnicz discusses various effects of utterances in his paper, Logical Roots of Linguistic Communication. I will explore some of what he is trying to capture in that paper in a similar but slightly different way by characterizing how elocutionary acts of commanding, promising, requesting, and asserting change situation in dynamified multi-agent deontic epistemic logic. And I will also briefly mention background conditions that are necessary for those elocutionary acts to be performed in saying things. Now let me go on to the second section. And this diagram shows the development of DMEDL. And it is developed in a way similar to public announcement logic is developed. So you have two logic here. Bottom one is a static-based logic, and it is multi-agent epistemic deontic logic, which has a formula of this form. And so you have epistemic operator and deontic operator of this form. And by adding dynamic modalities, we get a dynamic formula and dynamic logic. And by listing recursion actions, we can define rewriting algorithms that takes formulas from the dynamic language and use formulas in the static language. And if this allows us to derive completeness of dynamic logic from the completeness of static logic. Now, this is the syntax for the static language and for the dynamic language. And dynamic language obtained by adding formula of this form to the static logic. And pi here can be either this one or this one or this one. And these are considered as a type of elocutionary acts. Now, here is the intended readings. And this formula is intended to mean it is obligatory upon agent I with respect to J in the name of K to suit its phi, where I is agent who owes the obligation, and J is agent to whom the obligation is owed, and K is agent who creates the obligation. And these and then the intended readings for dynamic formulas. For example, this is intended to mean whenever agent I commands an agent J to see to it that psi hold after that. And similarly for acts of promising and acts of requesting. Now, this is a definition of the model. And the truth definition for the static logic and the dynamic logics are both given with reference to this model. And here we have epistemic accessibility relation to be used for interpreting epistemic modality, and accessibility relation to be used for interpreting deontic operator. So for each agent I, we have separate accessibility relation for epistemic operator. And for each triad of agent IJK, we have a separate accessibility relation for interpreting the deontic operator. Now, this is a truth definition for the dynamic formulas. And so, truth of the dynamic formula as a word W in the model M is defined in terms of the truth of the subformula as a word W in an updated model. And these updated models are defined this way. So, for example, this one is a model obtained from M by replacing this particular deontic accessibility relation with this subset satisfying this condition. And similarly, this is a model updated by Axel Promisen and which is obtained by replacing this particular deontic accessibility relation with this subset satisfying this condition. And this is for accessible requesting, where we have a bit complex condition. Now, here is some result. So if phi is a formula from the static language and the deontic operator of this form does not occur in phi, then this comes to be valid. So this means whenever agent I command J to sit that phi, it is obligatory for, in the resulting situation, it is obligatory for J to sit with respect to I by the name of I to sit that phi. Here, the agent who owes the obligation is a commandee, whereas agent who creates the obligation is a commander. Now, in the case of Axel Promisen, we have slightly different deontic operator here. Please note the order of the indices here. So in this case, the agent who owes the obligation is a promiser, and the agent who creates the obligation is also the promiser. So the sameness of these indices indicates that this is this obligation represents the commitment of the promiser herself. So this is whenever agent I promises J that I will see to it that phi, this holds. Now, according to this semantics, it becomes possible to represent conflicts of commands in a nice way. So here we have one and the same agent receives first from authority I a command to sit it at P. And after that, J receives command to sit it at P from the another authority K. Then in the resulting situation, J is in such a quandary. So, with respect to I, J has to sit it at P, and with respect to K, J has to sit it at not P. But since it is not possible to respect both obligations jointly, so this is a dilemma. So agent J has to choose. But note that this does not lead to deontic explosion, since these two deontic operators are different operators. Similarly, even acts of promising and acts of commanding can be in conflict. And again, this does not lead to deontic explosion. So we can represent conflicts of commands or conflicts of promise or conflicts of pair of promise and commands in without generating deontic explosion. Now, this is the result for acts of requesting. If the deontic operator of this form doesn't occur in phi, then it is valid. Now here, let us compare this with acts of commanding and acts of promising. So here we have same deontic operator here. So this shows that acts of requesting have some similarity with acts of commanding. But there is also difference. So in the case of acts of commanding, the agent commandee is obligated to sit that phi, but no such thing is obligated. Here, the commandee, requestee is obligated to make choice. So in the case of requesting, the requestee have a choice of not doing what she is requested to do. So here, in the resulting situation, agent requestee is obliged to see to it that phi, or let the requester know that this is similar to the act of operator in the act of promising. So let the requester know that J will see to it that phi by J's own name. So J is committed to see that phi. Or let the requester know that J is not committed to see that phi. So here is a choice. Now, but this may be possibly puzzling. So since phi implies phi or this one, and so if we have this, then we also have this. Now, what this means? Now, this is closely related to Ross's paradox. So post the letter or burn it. I think you know about that. But note that neither seeing to it that this one hold nor seeing to it that this one hold is a way of obeying the command of this form. Just the truth of Q does not guarantee the truth of P, although the truth of Q guarantees the truth of P or Q. So things are slightly complicated. And a complete set of recursion axioms for DMEDL is presented in my paper, though I forgot to present the necessitation rules for dynamic modalities and the proof system for DL. So that paper needs to be supplemented. This is my mistake. And here is further comparison. A command of this form updates the model in exactly the same way as a request of this form. This may look, again, puzzling. This, however, does not mean that a request is a command. An act of commanding involves invoking of authority, but an act of requesting doesn't invoke authority, though this difference is not addressed in DMEDL. For more on this point, see my paper. As regards commands of this form, please note that seeing to that this one hold is a way of obeying it, but it is not a way of obeying this command. So these commands are different, even if phi implies phi or this one or this one. And so, and this can be confirmed by checking how these commands change the situation. These two commands change the situation differently by updating the model in different ways. Now let me move on to acts of asserting. Agents who make assertions are often said to be committed to the truth of their assertions. The notion of propositional commitment is introduced into the study of dialogue by Hamlin and studied by Walton and Krabbe with reference to a persuasion dialogue. And Walton and Krabbe distinguish commitments incurred by making concession and commitments called assertions. We refer to the commitment of the first type as C commitments and those of the second type as A commitment, reserving the term assertion for acts of asserting. Now, according to Walton and Krabbe, propositional commitments constitute a special case of commitment to a course of action. This is very important. And according to them, an agent who has an A commitment to a proposition is obliged to defend it if the other party in the dialogue requires her to justify it. And the agent who has a C commitment to a proposition is only obliged to allow the other party to use it in the argument. Now, let us confine our attention to A commitments. And here is a similar characterization given by McFarlane in a more general context. So in asserting that P at the context CU, one commits oneself to providing adequate grounds for the truth of P in response to any appropriate challenge, or to deferring this responsibility to another asserter on whose testimony one is relying. one can be released from this commitment only by withdrawing the assertion. This formulation presupposes Macfarlane's distinction of the context of assessment from the context of use and the circumstance of evaluation. But the point important for the present discussion does not depend on this distinction. And the option of deferring the responsibility to another asserter on whose testimony one is relying is mentioned in order to take care of the cases where the asserter have learned what he is asserting from another asserter. We can cover such cases by taking adequate grounds here broadly. So as Austin had pointed out in his famous paper, Othermind, a reply to the challenge, how do you know? To the utterance of there's a beetle at the bottom of the garden can be something like this. So if we think of these as giving of adequate grounds, then we can cover this. Now, what does providing adequate ground for the truth of P amount to? Here, Williamson's knowledge account suggests an interesting possibility. So this we extend DMEDL to DMEDL plus by just adding this fourth form of formulas. Other parts are unchanged. Then Williamson's knowledge account asserts that the rule of assertion is the following rule. One must assert P only if one knows P. What is interesting about this rule is the following fact. If one knows a P, one must be able to provide adequate grounds for the truth of P in response to any appropriate challenge. And this suggests the possibility of characterizing what a commitment amounts to in terms of knowledge. And since false assertion, one's knowing P is not a necessary condition for one's utterance to count as an assertion. Borrowing Macfarlane's phrase again, what is necessary rather is something like the following. One's utterance to the effect that P is an act of asserting P only if that commit one to provide adequate grounds for the truth of P in response to any appropriate challenge. Now consider this one. And this principle requires agent I's commitment of this form, but not agent I's knowledge of this form to be a necessary condition for I to assert phi. Thus, it doesn't preclude room for false assertions. It nonetheless requires I to know phi in the sense that it becomes obligatory for agent I by the name of I to know phi. And by this interpretation, we can show that principle to be valid. But here is some worry. I do not think it's bad to have a principle like this, but this principle doesn't seem good enough to express what a commitment amount to. The kind of thing I has to do to satisfy the obligation to know phi seems to be different from the kind of thing agent I has to do in response to an appropriate challenge. An agent who asserts P seems to undertake the same commitment as the commitment she undertakes when she promises that she will provide adequate grounds for the truth of P in response to any appropriate challenge. So is there a way of expressing something close to this in our language? Now, if an agent provides adequate grounds for the truth of P in response to an appropriate challenge, the challenge can thereby learn that P. For the sake of simplicity, let us ignore the condition in response to an appropriate challenge. Then the following principle seems to be something very close to the kind of things an agent who asserts phi is committed to. Now here we have J here, not I. So what this means? This means whenever agent I assert phi to J, it becomes obligatory for an agent I to see to it that J knows phi. So, as Williamson pointed out to me in a discussion, however, J might be irrationally refuse to believe phi, even if I has given adequate grounds for knowing phi. Now, even if J refused this to believe phi, however, I can be said to have done what she has committed herself to doing if she has given J adequate grounds for knowing phi. So what about the following? So this is AUG principle. Assertion usually generate obligation principle. This said, if an agent, whenever agent I assert phi to j, agent I is committed to see to it that this. So here we have similarity with acts of promising, but also acts of commanding. So this principle is shown to be valid on this interpretation. And what this means, so here we see a similarity between acts of asserting and acts of promising. So in the case of acts of promising, promiser commits herself to see to it at phi, while in the case of acts of asserting, asserter commits herself to seeing to that this holds. And so in that sense, this operator represents the asserter's commitment, and the asserter commits herself to see to it that this one holds. Now, what this hold means? This is similar to, there is some similarity to acts of commanding. And this similarity seems to be suggested by Williamson. If an agent I knows phi and asserts phi to j, she represents herself to j as having the very kind of authority to make that assertion. If an agent I assert phi to j, she commits herself to seeing to it that j should run phi in her name. But how can she do that? Just by providing adequate grounds. Now, is there a way of expressing the condition in response to any appropriate challenge? I think one possibility is to do this, but here we have acts of demanding. So in order to make this idea work, we need to characterize how acts of demanding change situation. We read this for further study. And let me go into the final part of my talk. So look at this conversation. A private said to sergeant, clean this room. Then the sergeant answered, you don't have the authority to give me a command. Normally, private would not say things like this to a sergeant. By contrast, the following looks normal. But why this is normal? Because the sergeant has a suitable authority to issue such a command. So the condition that the agent has the suitable authority to issue such and such a command is a condition that must be satisfied in order for her act of saying so and so to count as an act of commanding. So things are related in this way. A sergeant is saying that clean this room, addressing a private B and pointing to a room R, count as acts of commanding, thanks to the authority. But after this count as acts of commanding, then it makes B obligated to see that R is clean with respect to A by the name of A. This is stated by CUGO principle. And so CUGO principle and other similar principles characterize what John Seale calls status function of elocutionary acts. And it is what J. Rothstein has in mind when he characterizes conventional effects or a particular kind of consequential effects of elocutionary act as what we regard as mere conventional consequences. I believe research journalists will surely be interested in this reconciliation of Rothstein and Seale, as well as in the application of deontic logic in the analysis of the assertion commitment. That's it. Thank you.